Well, good evening, everyone. We're glad to have you out this evening. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's evening lecture for February. My name is Trey Gaines. I'm director of the museum, and we're glad to have you out to join us this evening. Before we begin, I'll go over a couple of items. We are recording tonight's lecture, and it will be available on the members portal of our website soon. You do have the opportunity to mute yourself and turn off your camera if that's comfortable for you. We will have questions at the end, but if you have something come up that you'd like to ask, feel free to interject or raise your hand that we can see you. And you can also write something in the chat. We can monitor that as well. Dr. Myrick-Harris has indicated that she is willing to answer questions as we go, and she'll ask us some questions along the way as well. Some brief announcements. Next month's evening lecture will be on Thursday, March 25th at 7 p.m. Leslie Barker Thomas, who's the past president of the Georgia Trail of Tears Association, will join us to discuss the preservation of Cherokee history here in Northwest Georgia. This will be a Zoom lecture also. Just a reminder, the museum is open. We're open Monday through Saturday, 10 to 5. And with all the safety precautions in place, and we'll be excited to see you in the museum. We're pleased to welcome tonight our guest speaker, public historian and scholar, Dr. Clarissa Myrick-Harris. She's professor of Africana Studies and chair of the Humanities Division at Morehouse College. She was the convener of the committee to commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement, which has developed the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative to share the stories and lessons of student activism of the 1960s with young activists fighting against social injustices of today. She has also served as the chair of the Georgia Historic Preservation Review Board, granting national landmark status to structures around Georgia. Dr. Myrick-Harris began her work as a public historian as curator for the Apex Museum, which is the African American Panoramic Experience Museum in Atlanta, while an Emory University graduate student in the 1980s. Since then, she has curated or co-curated a number of exhibits and written extensively on the people and places of the civil rights movement, including Auburn Avenue Street of Pride, Red Was the Midnight, the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot, a study for the National Park Service titled How They Lived, which focused on the last home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the childhood home of Maynard Jackson, called The Women, the tradition of African-American female activism in Georgia during the Civil Rights Movement, and much, much more. Dr. Myrick-Harris earned a PhD in American Studies with an emphasis on African-American Studies from Emory University, a master's degree in news editorial journalism from the Ohio State University, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Morris Brown College. Dr. Myrick-Harris, welcome. We're glad to have you here tonight, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here. There we are. And I'm just going to scroll through so I can see your faces. And I think our group is small enough. It may grow a bit, and that would be good too, but I think it's small enough to think of this more as I hate the word lecture, especially when we're in a virtual environment like this. And I want you all to be as engaged as possible. So it'll be a discussion, conversation, as in my role as the convener of the the committee to commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement's Atlanta Student Movement Initiative. What we're doing is a series of conversations. I'm also, and I didn't note this, I'm also involved with leadership, essentially leading the Morehouse Initiative collaboration with Points of Light, which is the Bush family foundation that focuses on volunteerism. Our partnership with Points of Light at this phase it's called Listen, Learn, Act to End Racism. And this first phase of it involves a series of conversations. We just had one earlier today on the role of historically Black colleges and universities in really birthing leadership for social movements since their inception in the 19th century after the Civil War, and we had a few even before the Civil War, of course. And so the next, and I'm a shameless plug here, the next conversation in partnership with Points of Light will be on March 18th. And that will be a conversation, and that is called, and I borrowed from one of my book chapters on Southern Black women. It's called Call the Women, the impact of the impact of women's activism from civil rights to social justice movements. And so again, that's March 18th at 1 o'clock. Okay. Now to our subject at hand. Okay. And when I got the call and was at email, then call conversation with Trey and then others about this topic, I was extremely excited. The piece, I guess, that Trey saw, the origins of the civil rights movement in Atlanta, had been published, 15 years ago, or almost, or more. Yeah, or more now, because this is 2021. And I wrote that after having written an essay and timeline and done research for a database for the Atlanta Regional Council for Higher Education. And I noticed that they have reactivated that. It's been around now for 15 years or so, but it is a repository, a digital repository of the resources on the civil rights movement at the 9 Atlanta Regional Consortium of Higher Education, Council of Higher Education Institutions. And so the origins of the civil rights movement in the 19th century kind of predates that. You know, when I wanted to take it back a bit more, because I just did a really quick run through of that in that longer essay. And so what I'm doing here is to provide some context first in terms of the status of African Americans after the Civil War and how really the seeds of activism and the spirit of protest and empowerment began during that phase. And we know that it began during enslavement with resistance, whether day-to-day work slowdowns or actual attempts at revolt, and of course by attempts to escape, successful escapes through the Underground Railroad. And so activism is very much a part of our history and the fight for freedom, which I refer to as the fight for freedom and literacy. And now I'm going to share a screen. So good seeing you all. I don't know if I'll still be visible, but let's go to the PowerPoint if I can. Okay, good. I'm going to start from the beginning. Okay, there we go. Movement, Atlanta's journey to leadership in the quest for civil and human rights in the mid-19th through mid-20th centuries. Okay. I am referring to this quest, this journey, as the quest for freedom and literacy. But here we mean more than freedom and literacy in the, as you usually think of it, in terms of freedom from physical bondage and freedom even from mental and emotional bondage. Here, freedom refers to the ability to learn and fully comprehend the dimensions and nuances of African American history and heritage, as well as embarking on an inward journey to awaken and embrace racial memory and Black identity. So freedom is really about reconnecting to a history that was denied for so very, very long. Literacy in this context means utilizing that knowledge to read and negotiate current realities, to determine one's own place, purpose, and contributions in the community and the world. So literacy goes beyond learning to read and write. It goes beyond becoming fluent in a language or beyond mastering a particular discipline and being a well-educated person, although that is an essential component of the quest for freedom and literacy. In fact, it's a foundational component, as we'll talk about a little later. But this quest for freedom and literacy has been going on among people of African descent around the globe, really, for all of our existence within the context of our own societies, but especially within the context of those societies that have attempted to repress and enslave us. Lincoln's legacy. Okay, this month, okay, we have Black History Month. We have the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. Let's see, this is the 154th, this is the 112th birthday, it wasn't quite that, 112th birthday of Abraham Lincoln, the 156 years since he signed the 13th Amendment. A lot went on in the month of February. But also, a question I raise here is, what is Lincoln's legacy when it comes to the quest for freedom and literacy? There's a series going on now, and perhaps some of you have seen it. I think there have been, 2 or 3 episodes of it. Lincoln Divided, We Stand. And I'll just ask for, can I do a show? I can't do a show of hands. So just yell out, have you seen any of those episodes? There've been 2 or 3 Any of you, just say yes, no.
No.
If you haven't, you can unmute.
I have not.
Anyone in the session who has seen an episode, the first 2 episodes, you should watch it. And it's important because it is really an attempt to give a fuller, more holistic, and more multidimensional view of Lincoln and who he was, his legacy in terms of the quest for freedom and literacy. He's known as the great emancipator. And so they look at that and the issues that he dealt with, his challenges, his struggles, his vacillation and contradiction of himself at various points in time. And then, but also his focus and something that we don't know a lot about, but from very early on in his political career, he supported colonization of Black people. He did not want slavery to expand to the Western territories. He detested slavery itself. He believed African Americans had the right to human rights, but when it came to civil rights, that was a different matter. And his solution that he really carried with him onto his presidency, onto the 4 days before he died, his solution, okay, we free the enslaved, and then we send them to Africa or to the Caribbean or to Central America. And if all else fails, we'll just have some domestic colonies in the Sea Islands. So that's another story. So did Lincoln believe that African Americans had the right to true freedom and literacy in this country, or did he, an almost genetic form of racism, prevent him from seeing Black people as deserving of total liberation and access to all the benefits of citizenship? We know that he did sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and actually he signed the first version of it in September of 1862. In that first version of it, there was actually a clause about taking African Americans and resettling them elsewhere. That was taken out by the time he signed it in January and issued it. And we know that the purpose of that Emancipation Proclamation was to abolish enslavement in those states that were at war with the Union, the Confederacy. In terms of the border states that were still a part of the Union, African Americans and the enslaved were not included in that decree. The Confederacy does not recognize the proclamation, and some Black people don't even find out about it. We all know about, about Juneteenth, and that was when some African Americans, especially in Texas, is where they first celebrated it. They celebrated it throughout the South now, but they just weren't told that they had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. A great thing that occurred, and one of the motivating factors for Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, a major component of that as a tactic was also to get reinforcements for a depleted Union military. So many had died, so many had deserted. And as much as Lincoln resisted throughout the war, he realized that if they were going to continue and perhaps find victory, they had to bring in fresh blood, new people. And then there were some of his generals who had actually gone ahead and recruited some formerly enslaved African Americans as they went through and freed the Sea Islands in particular, also in Louisiana. And they performed, the formerly enslaved African American men, the freed men, performed valiantly on the battlefield. About 200,000 African Americans served in the Civil War. And truth be told, the Union may not have won the war were it not for their service. Freedom laws, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and then there were the first Civil Rights Act. After 4 bitter years of the Civil War, and I say here the second phase of Reconstruction, because the first phase of Reconstruction is considered actually from around 1862 until 1865. And 1862, because there were actual efforts to begin the process of reconstructing and reuniting the country, even as the war raged on. I mentioned the Sea Islands. There was an experiment called the Port Royal experiment, in which the property that had been left by fleeing plantation owners who were leaving when the Union came in after Sherman's march to the sea. Remember, Sherman came to Atlanta. He brought his men. He burned all the rail stations and the various supply structures, and then after resting for a little bit in Atlanta, he continued the march on to Savannah, and that march to the sea, the actual taking over of Atlanta, and then the march on to Savannah were pivotal to the Union victory that would occur a few years later. And then, well, that occurred beginning in 64, actually, so a few months later. And so that's called wartime reconstruction from 1862 till 1865. The 13th Amendment was meant to constitutionally abolish slavery throughout the United States. However, not until after Georgia became the last state to ratify it in December of 1865 did the 13th Amendment actually take effect. All the states had to ratify it before it could be put in play. Beginnings of Black political empowerment. In January of 1866, less than a year after the end of the Civil War, a group of African American men and a few white men as well, but it was primarily a body of African American men and men primarily, if not exclusively, met as the Georgia Equal Rights and Education Association. And they met in Augusta, Georgia, in the Springfield Baptist Church, a Black church, which is arguably the oldest, if not one of the 2 oldest Black churches in the country. So they met there, established to educate Black women, men, and men about their rights as citizens, but also about, it was for the education to talk about how to educate the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Black people who had been forbidden to learn to read and write, who were prohibited legally throughout the South. And of course, their concern was here in Georgia, but this was going on in states across the South. African American people coming together to discuss ways they could build community and empower themselves, find freedom, find literacy on every level. And as the Republican Party takes shape in Georgia, the majority of the members are African American men. Remember, back in this time, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, was the liberal party in the country. Georgia resistance to Black citizenship. The Georgia legislature refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, refused. And that amendment, of course, would give citizenship to all African Americans and penalize states that denied Black male voting rights. And then, of course, it was, however, ratified anyway, even though they refused in 1866. By 1868, because of the election of Black legislators and the also the presence of some more moderate, progressive white Republicans, the 14th Amendment was ratified. And that was pushed through also in the face of Black codes that Georgia and other Southern states had put in place to take the place of enslavement. Black codes that had to do with where Black people could live, the kind of work they could do, the creation of really the beginnings of the sharecropping system, so, and the convict lease system, so ways to still keep African Americans in bondage. Okay. Okay, this second phase, or really third phase, I say second here, should be third, called of Reconstruction, was called Radical Reconstruction. And this was a period in which the liberal legislation was passed. And Blacks in Georgia seized this opportunity to redefine ourselves as citizens rather than chattel. African Americans had three primary objectives: reuniting their families that had been scattered across, and some families were never reunited because family members had been sold off to different places and they could not track them down. If you look at some papers, newspapers from the era, you will see ads and some gut-wrenching advertisements, people looking to find aunts, uncles, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and they put the ads in the paper trying to track them down. So reuniting families, building strong, self-sufficient communities that included a foundation with the education, with educational institutions. During the Civil War and before, during the period of enslavement, all through enslavement, African Americans, even though beginning here in Georgia around 1829, 1830, there were laws on the books prohibiting the teaching of both enslaved and free African Americans to read and write and just education in general. Even though those laws were in place, there were secret schools in operation, even on plantations, free and enslaved Blacks who were in cities and towns. There were those among them who were literate in the traditional sense, who had a degree of education, and they risked their lives. And the students coming into those schools risked their lives to learn to read and write. And so education was really a top priority. In 1868, and I'm going to go more swiftly because my time is zipping on by, but in 1868, 32 Black legislators won seats in the Georgia State General Assembly. And they are the ones who finally helped ratify that 14th Amendment, as I said earlier. However, in September of 1868, the white legislators, primarily Dixiecrats, members of the Democratic Party, which was the party with white supremacists at that point in time, they argued that they did not have the right, well, although they had been given the right to vote, that did not include the right to hold office, so they kicked out all 32 of those Black legislators. When those legislators and hundreds of their supporters and some white Republicans marched to a site in Camilla, Georgia, to protest the expulsion of those legislators, they were met with violent opposition by white supremacists. And at least 9 African Americans were shot to death. And what you see here is an affidavit by a woman named Maria Jones, who was a 32-year-old woman who tells of seeing shots fired at her neighbor, who was a freed man. After that occurred in 1870, by 2 years later, 1870, the expelled African American state legislators are reinstated, they reseated, and Georgia was forced to ratify the 15th Amendment guaranteeing African American men, we know at this time, women didn't get to vote until 1920, but African American men had the right to vote at that time after the Supreme Court ruling. Okay, I'm fast forwarding now, getting to Atlanta, Georgia. We know Atlanta has always been unique. It has been a center of commerce over time. After the Civil War, there was a movement, a booster movement, a PR campaign launched by some of the city fathers, the white power structure. They wanted Atlanta to be viewed as the new South, the gateway to the South. And so they did everything they could to promote that. Henry Grady, the journalist, even went on a grand tour. He went all up in New England promoting Atlanta because there was this push to rebuild the economy. since the plantation system had been eliminated. In Atlanta, per se, the city of Atlanta was not a place with plantations, but they had a number of industries that also depended on enslaved labor. And so after the Civil War, Atlanta had this push. Atlanta also began to host the Cotton State Exposition, and the 1881 Cotton State Exposition in particular was a big deal. They were always a big deal. People came from all over. Also occurring in 1881, and it was very intentional. Washerwomen, primarily African-American washerwomen. These are women who did the laundry of the city, of the white elite, the white middle class, even in some cases, white working class. They hired Black women to do their laundry. There were no washing machines, there were no dryers. And so it was a way that Black women, one of the primary ways, besides being a domestic worker in a home, that they could make a living. This was independent work. They pick up the laundry, they take it home, they wash it, they iron it, fold it, and they take it back. But their conditions, working conditions or payment and hours, horrendous. And so they went on strike. They planned it, they met, they formed a washing society. They had some Black women white women, washerwomen among their number. And they timed the strike so it would be during the same time as the Cotton State Exposition, when they knew their services would really be needed. Long story short, in the end, they were able to get better wages, better conditions, because they wanted them to stop the strike during this important time in the city. Georgia became the first Southern state that same year, 1881, to pass legislation segregating streetcars. In response to that, in Atlanta, Black women and men carried out a successful boycott and continued to protest segregation ordinances, because they would come back and keep writing new ordinances, and Black people were kept protesting up until 1906. 1906, that's a pivotal year. I'm going to stop for a second. Any questions or anything to be clarified? Again, I've been doing a lot of talking, so if you have a question. Nope, okay. Okay, also late 19th century, early 20th century, Atlanta, just as Henry Grady and the members of the white power structure were attempting to rebuild the infrastructure of Atlanta and project it as the gateway to the South, African Americans in Atlanta were also building community, establishing businesses, establishing schools and social organizations and institutions, so much so that by mid-20th century, Sweet Auburn Avenue, which is in Northeast Atlanta, became known as the richest Negro street in the world. It was called that by Fortune magazine in the mid-1950s. That was after 5 decades or more of the building of Auburn Avenue. So in this segregated South, and around this time, in the early 20th century, not the 1950s, but the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, Atlanta was really known as one of the most segregated cities in the country. Yet it also had that counter image as a city that was progressive, that was the gateway to the South. Also in Atlanta, you had the coming together of the institutions of the Atlanta University Center. Morehouse College, the institution where I teach, started out in Augusta, Georgia in 1867, in that same church where they had the first Georgia Equal Rights and Educational Association meeting. And then by 1879, it moved to Atlanta as Atlanta Baptist Seminary, and then became Morehouse soon after that. Also in Atlanta, we had the Atlanta University, which was established in 1866, a year after the end of the Civil War. And interestingly enough, Atlanta University and later Morehouse College and what became Clark College, and even a part of Spelman College, all now located by the 1930s, they all were located in Southwest Atlanta, and same general vicinity. All of that land in that area are the sites of former Civil War battles and former encampments of Confederate troops. The Atlanta University, when they first started digging up, excavating and constructing, I'm told, and on even until the 20th century, they sometimes ran across bodies, skeletal remains of soldiers, Confederate soldiers, and perhaps in battle, some of the Union soldiers as well, even though we know that Sherman won the Battle of Atlanta. But in any case, it's ironic that the institutions of the Atlanta University Center are located in that area where the Confederate military, where the Confederacy attempted to hold off the Union military. And so the presence of, and the Atlanta University Center institutions, that consortium of institutions became known as the largest consortium of historically Black colleges and universities, they say in the United States, but really in the world. And that was so as those institutions converged and all came together and all were born by the beginning of the 20th century, they were all operating and producing the leadership, not only of the city, not only of the state, not only of the region, but of the nation. We had the emergence of national Black leadership during this time. On the right, we have Booker T. Washington, who some hate and some love. And on the left, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an integrationist. Washington, the accommodationist, Du Bois, the integrationist, and they butted heads, even though at one point in time, W.E.B. Du Bois actually applied for a job at Tuskegee. He didn't get it for whatever reason, but, and I suppose later he didn't regret that. I think the next year he ended up at Atlanta University, W.E.B. Du Bois, Atlanta University in 1895. 1895 was also the same year that Booker T. Washington gave his famous Atlanta Compromise speech during the 1896 Cotton State Exposition. In any case, that was an opportunity for him to essentially tell the nation that, hey, Black people don't want equality. We don't want to live with you. We don't want to work with you on the same level. We don't necessarily even want same political rights that you have. We can live as separate as the five fingers on the hand, but united in all things that work to common good. And that's a paraphrase. So this is the 1895 Cotton State Exposition, yes. Okay, so he puts that out there, and the white community, and not only in Atlanta, but nationally, eat it up. They love it. They love this man. He's a accommodationist. He believes in separate, not even equal. And so they embrace him, and he becomes the greatest leader, the go-to leader when the white power structure, white leaders want to know what to do in terms of Black people. They went to Washington. He built this Tuskegee machine. Meanwhile, W.E.B. Du Bois, a professor at Atlanta University, is just really very upset, to say the least, at that accommodationist stance. So much so that he leads the establishment of what was called the Niagara Movement. He does this while he is a professor at Atlanta University. And he does this with the assistance of some of his buddies at Atlanta University, on the campus of Atlanta University. One, Robert Towns, and the gentleman you see with the boy on his lap, that's Robert Towns, I believe. Right behind Towns, you see a man named Alonzo Herndon. Alonzo Herndon built a fabulous mansion, and I'll show you that slide in a minute, on the campus of what is now Morris Brown College. The Morris Brown College, you've been to the campus in Atlanta, that is the former campus, the original campus of Atlanta University. And on that campus, there is this beautiful mansion that was built by the richest Black man in Atlanta and perhaps in the South during this time, during the late 19th, early 20th century, Alonzo Herndon. And he was a barber, and he developed what later became the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. So he was an early civil rights activist as well, and lended his support to the movement. And a part of that support was the helping to establish the Niagara Movement, which was a precursor to the NAACP. So here you see local men, Atlanta African-American men, Towns, Herndon, and Wright, the gentleman with the hat next to Towns, W.E.B. Du Bois, who brought these men together at Niagara Falls to talk about how to approach the struggle, the quest for freedom and literacy, the quest for self-determination, self-definition. And by the way, the little boy you see there on the lap of Towns, that is the son of the gentleman in the derby, Alonzo Herndon, who is the rich barber and owner of the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. His son, Herndon, and his first name is escaping me right now, but he grew up to take over the business, the family business, and also be a supporter of the civil rights movement. He actually put skin in the game. He bailed people out of jail. He ensured civil rights leaders and workers when they went out on marches and demonstrations and sit-ins. And so again, Atlanta has that legacy of producing and being the home of leaders who took on national significance. And the Herndons here, Alonzo, the son, and the wife, Mrs. Herndon actually was a teacher, and her name, for some reason, I guess it's late, her first name is escaping me, but she was actually a drama professor at Atlanta University. They lived right there on the campus of what was Atlanta University. What was unique about that institution also during that time was that it was an integrated island. It was in the midst of segregated Atlanta. On that hill, you had African-American and European-American instructors living in the same buildings, dormitories, with their Black students, and there were even at various points in time white students who were the sons and daughters of white instructors, because initially most of the professors, the faculty were white, and then they slowly began to bring on Black faculty, such as Ms. Herndon, such as George Towns, and others. So that was this little bubble, integrated bubble in the midst of one of the most segregated cities in the South. In 1906, things came to a head because that was the year before, now the same year that the Niagara Movement was established as a national civil rights organization, was the year that Henry Grady, remember Henry Grady, the booster, the white booster for Atlanta, who wants to promote it as the gateway of the South, his newspaper and other newspapers in the city began to talk about, and it was proven that they were making up stories about assault on white women by Black men. And they did this. Keep in mind that there was some trepidation and a feeling of being threatened by the growing, sophisticated, educated, and increasingly wealthy in relative terms, Black community. These Black people, just a couple of decades out of enslavement, were advancing. And so there were all kinds of measures put in place to really undermine that. There was also an attempt to galvanize the white community to make sure that the elite and the working class were on the same page, because there have been instances throughout history when working class and poor whites would sometimes galvanize or work with, join Black people. Case in point, the Washerwomen strike of 1881, because they had a common purpose: gaining more wages, rights, better working conditions. Well, there were concerted efforts in Atlanta and elsewhere in the country to really make sure that the working poor, white, and the everyday white folks in Atlanta and throughout the state and throughout the region and nation, ultimately, to make sure that they were aligned with the elite, the white elite, to beat back this threat. So the 1906 Atlanta race riot was covered around the world. This is a story about it from a French newspaper called Le Petit Journal. And so it made not only national news, international news, and dozens, and we really will never know how many African Americans were killed. A few white individuals were killed as well. And the story is African Americans were attempting, this is 1906, when one of those ordinances against integrating the streetcars took place. Well, Black people were getting on the streetcars, trying to get to where they were going. And there was a situation that a number of white passengers and others out, and this is downtown Atlanta, they start dragging Black people off the streetcars, beating them, and in some cases killing them. They dragged one man to the base of the statue that we have in downtown Atlanta, still have it downtown Atlanta, to Henry Grady. They killed him and put him at the feet of that statue. They attacked women, they attacked youths, and they killed as many as they could. They vandalized Black businesses that were downtown. Alonzo Herndon had one of his barbershops for the white elite downtown. They broke the windows, they vandalized, and another other Black businesses that were downtown. Now, the composition of the rioters, again, the white rioters who were attacking Black people, it was diverse. There was a big showing. This was downtown, so there have been some movie showing in a downtown theater. This is a period of first of the silent films, I guess. Some big event. And so people were coming out of the theater, coming out of restaurants. And so you had some of the city's elite, as well as the working class, middle class, joining forces. They had been riled up by these news stories, by the fake news stories in the local papers, and they were attacking Black people. And again, in part fueled by this fear of Black progress. And so in the wake of that, we have a segregated city, extremely segregated city, because up until the time of the riot, you had Black businesses downtown, and you had, it was still one of the most segregated cities in the South, but you did have pockets, you had streets that in one block would be Black, in one block would be white, and so on. Well, polarization began to occur on a greater level, so that you had whole regions of the city that were designated for whites, and then regions that were designated for only Black people. And within this, this renewed and reinforced and expanding segregation, there emerged what was called, and what is still called, the Atlanta Way. Now, ultimately, the Atlanta Way, and I'll go back for a second, this occurred, and this method occurred in the wake of the Atlanta race riot. And essentially, it was a situation where Black leaders, the ministers, some of the educators, and some of the business people, not all, but some of the leaders of the city, in trying to find a way forward, to find some pathway toward freedom and literacy, said, okay, well, we're going to try negotiation. We're going to try some degree of compromise, borrowing a little bit from Booker T. Washington. So what they would do they would meet clandestinely. They'd have these meetings of Black and white leadership where they would work out the details of whether it's the desegregation of buses, which occurred in the 1950s, when a group of Black ministers boycotted the city buses, as the people had boycotted in the 1880s. In the 1950s, they did it. They were arrested, and then they met with the leadership, and 2 years later, the buses were desegregated. And so that strategy just appeared and was developed, and to some extent, some argue that it still exists today, negotiation for change. but we know, the public schools were separate but not equal. And in response to that, as early as the 1920s, African American leaders galvanized and voted against a bond, a school bond, because it did not include funds for building a Black high school. There were no Black high schools in Atlanta before 1924, when Booker T. Washington High School was built. The only reason Booker T. Washington High School was built was because Black people, Black men, exercised their right to vote and voted against a bond issue. So when they made that vote, when they cast that vote, there had to be some negotiation, and the results of that negotiation was Washington High School was built. That's the school that both my parents attended. Martin Luther King Jr. attended. Anybody who was in Atlanta between the 1920s and the 1960s, mid to late 1960s, more than likely they graduated from Booker T. Washington High. Claiming civil rights in Atlanta. Okay, I'm going to move along faster here because we're running out of time, and I do want to have time for questions and answers. Okay, so women and our involvement in the movement, women played a major role in galvanizing the Black vote. We see what Stacey Abrams has been able to do, not her alone, but she's been in the forefront. She's been a primary leader of pulling people together, women, men, youth, old folks coming together to register African Americans to vote so that Atlanta and Georgia turned blue in this last election. Well, there's a tradition of that. And women like Ruby Blackburn, who led a big part of the voter registration campaign of 1946. She was a cosmetologist and a domestic worker, but she also had an organization called To Improve Conditions. And she galvanized and worked with other organizations, the Atlanta Voters League, which was headed by John Wesley Dobbs, Maynard Jackson's grandfather, and several other organizations. But the women were in the forefront of this. But of course, this time, Black women, white women have had the vote for a fourth of a century, 25 years. So they moved and they educated and they talked to students. The teachers talked to their students to tell their parents to vote. And so the end of that resulted in Black people exerting enough power not to vote a Black person in, but to vote in to the state legislature a white woman who was empathetic to the needs for rights among Black people. So that was a part of the Atlanta Way in operation. Black people galvanized their vote. They met, they negotiated with the power structure or people who were running for office. And then those who were willing to fight for change, some degree of change for African Americans, the Black electorate put their votes behind them. A woman named Grace Towns Hamilton that many people know nothing about. She was the first female director of the Atlanta Urban League, beginning in 1943. And 3 years later, she initiated this massive demographic study of the Black community that helped the canvassers, to help the leadership, help those who were within the organizations like To Improve Conditions and Atlanta Voters League, help them to identify where people were, where they needed to go to register voters. So she became a really adept strategist and negotiator during this part of the movement. Later, she was vilified because she was one who used the Atlanta Way to the advantage of African Americans. But I think time will show that she was indeed a really important person in our journey to freedom and literacy. So that's just hundreds of Black people voting in preparation for the 1946 election. 1948, the negotiation between Black power structure, white power structure resulted in the first Black policemen in the city. Retrenchment and redirection, and this around the time of Brown versus the Board of Education, which demanded the desegregation of schools across the nation. Atlanta dragged its feet, of course. And there were efforts, but Atlanta truly did not totally desegregate until, and we can argue that it's still not desegregated. And during the 50s and 60s, there were actions, but what happened was white flight. So as Black people moved in, Black people tried to go to a particular school. I can testify growing up in Atlanta in the 1960s as a child, there was a school called Grove Park that was a white elementary school. Because of desegregation, Black students were to start going to that school, but it was not desegregation. What happened was they moved the white students out of the school, put them elsewhere, and made it a Black school. But on that, I remember the first day of school, what was supposed to be the first day of school, going there, and there were white folks protesting because we had taken their school. So as it turned out, my parents took me and my sisters out. We did not go there because there were threats, bomb threats and other threats of violence. But direct action and desegregation from the 1960 through 1965 involved the Atlanta student movement. That's where that comes in. It is 7:52, 7:53, and I do want to have time for Q&A. So I'm going to speak very quickly about this. In 1960, really starting in the 1950s, students of the Atlanta University Center began to demonstrate. They would do sit-ins at the state capitol, the libraries, to win the right for African Americans to be in those places and not be segregated. And really, the mother was something most people don't know. The mother of Maynard Jackson, Irene Dobbs Jackson, actually became the first African American to get a library card from the main branch of the Atlanta Public Library. Black people we had our own branches throughout the city and the Black communities, but we were not allowed to check out books from the main library. And so she and a young man who was at the time a student and now is a prominent minister, Reverend Otis Moss Jr., became the first two Atlantans, first two African Americans to get a library card from the main branch of the Atlanta Public Library. 3 years or so after that, students came together right after the Greensboro sit-ins by students from North Carolina A&T, and the students in the Atlanta University Center, two Morehouse men in particular, a man named Lonnie King, not related to Martin Luther King, but he went to their church, and Julian Bond became leaders of this Atlanta student movement involving students from Spelman, students from what was then Clark College, Atlanta University, Morris Brown College, and the Interdenominational Theological Center. And the appeal for human rights it could really have been authored today, because all the things that they demanded, all the things they were protesting, unfortunately, are still going on today. Inequities in terms of hospitals, inequities in terms of the education, especially public education, in particular that African Americans have access to, law enforcement issues in terms of police violence. So it is unfortunate that those things are still a part of what we're grappling with, but it's good to know that there's a tradition of protest against those things. And this is the iconic picture with Julian Bond in the forefront. And there were white students involved in the Atlanta student movement. That's important to know. Students from Agnes Scott College, for example, and a couple of students, I think, from Georgia Tech, in addition to the Atlanta University Center. We just lost one of our white sisters in the movement, Constance Curry. I think she passed last year or maybe the year before, but a longtime Atlantan who was involved in the Atlanta student movement when she was a college student. And so they protested, they marched. Martin Luther King Jr. had a primary role in the Atlanta student movement, and the Atlanta student movement was propelled to a national level because of his enrollment. They got him to participate in a protest boycott of Rich's department store, and he was arrested. because of something to do with his license plate, and you know, they found something to arrest him for it. Took him to Reidsville. He thought he was going to die. Meanwhile, John Kennedy, who's running for president, calls Mrs. King. His brother, Robert Kennedy, is on the case as well, and they somehow managed to get King released. When that occurs, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., threw all of his energies into getting John F. Kennedy elected. And so the Black vote that year, 1960, interestingly enough, went from red to blue, went from Republican to Democrat. And that was the first time that had occurred since Roosevelt. Remember, the parties have flip-flopped over time, and it looks like they may be doing that again in a different way. But during this time, Black people voted Republican. But Kennedy, a Democrat, won in large measure because of the strong support that he received from the Black electorate after he was instrumental in getting King out of prison. So over time, this city became the headquarters for SCLC, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to the Southern Regional Council, and many other organizations, because ironically, of this image of the city as a progressive city, even though we know that the racism and the segregation still existed, but the fathers, the white power structure wanted that image projected. And so it was a safer space to be than many other places. Also, this is where the brain trust, this is where the critical mass of leaders and thinkers among our community, or in Black America, were located in the Atlanta University Center. And then we had those with wealth who supported the movement here as well. So it's a perfect environment for the leadership of the national civil rights movement, and what went on to become human rights movement, to flourish. I'm going to stop it now because we're at 8 o'clock. If we can take just a few more minutes for there to be questions and answers. I didn't finish my deck, unfortunately, but I know it's time for me to stop. And I will give you this so you can also have it if people want to take a look at it. So any questions or comments?
I was going to ask a question, Dr. Myrick-Harris, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
I know that I wanted to know what 1920 and the ability for women's voting came in. I know that the poll taxes were still very hard until 1945.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering when Black women were really able to cast their vote in Atlanta.
Well, that's an interesting question, because, you know, even though Black women got the vote in 1920, in the 1920s, it was very difficult for either Black men or Black women to vote. And then that was because of the white primaries. That was because of, you know, poll taxes. That was because of literacy exams that occurred. So even though theoretically they had the right to vote, just as Black men had the right to vote since the 15th Amendment, in reality, because of all the measures put in place to keep them from voting, it was difficult. But they used that vote on a local level and on a state or national level, for sure, when they cast a vote for president and so on. But they used it on a local and a state level, again, at critical moments, they were able to galvanize the vote. So many people just didn't bother to register to vote because they knew they felt they had no power. But because we had Black leaders, women and men with vision and foresight, who knew that if the bit of voting power they had, if they could pull together at critical moments and exercise that power, they could make a difference in their lives, in their journey for freedom and literacy.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
So I actually have a comment, but I was just wondering how much if you have any information on this concept. So one of the things that I've heard about was especially in the 1960s in the civil rights movement. When they would go and do sit-ins and they would be arrested in large numbers, there was this idea of the jail no bail concept.
Yes.
Where, because you talked a lot throughout the presentation about how they negotiated the white power structure and worked with it. And I think that's just one of the great examples where they would stay in jail and put the burden on the system to have themselves released or to have their charges taken down. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, if you just had a few
Sure,
seconds.
and that was a policy really that you found in operation, especially among students, not only students in the Atlanta student movement, but throughout. And as SNCC became a national organization, and then you had CORE and you had the Freedom Rides and so on. But speaking specifically of what occurred in Atlanta, yeah, they would go to jail, and some stayed longer than others. Some, stayed a while. Others were got out sooner. When their cases went before the court, and someone whose name most people don't know, Donald Hollowell, was really the attorney, the lawyer for the civil rights movement. And he got many people, including Lonnie King and Martin Luther King Jr. and many of the women and others who were a part of the movement. He would argue their case and get them out of jail. But yes, there were a couple of instances during the Atlanta student movement. Once the students joined forces with the old guard, the older civil rights leaders, and initially there was a little bit of tension, but there was not a chasm between them. They came together. So you found John Wesley Dobbs, who had been a leader in the 30s and 40s. He boycotted Rich's department store in the 1960s. And you found others who supported what the students were doing. And yes, they used that strategy at the time, and his name is escaping me, but the police chief during that time was, he was white, of course, but more of a moderate. And so he was willing to negotiate and say, okay, we'll let them go to jail and they'll stay a couple of days and then we'll let them out. So they were able to use that Atlanta way approach with him because of his mindset. But it didn't always work. And I've heard some horrific stories about the way that individuals were treated when they went to jail, whether it was a few days or a week or more. It was still jail. And they were still serving time. They still had been arrested. So it was still not necessarily a positive experience. And so again, there is a debate that continues about the efficacy of the Atlanta way. If it was appropriate, if it was right, if it really yielded as much as it could have, on one hand, and then of course, well, because of the Atlanta way, didn't have the kinds of riots there were in other parts of the country. Didn't have the deaths that we had, killings on the level, but killings remain, lynching, and I didn't even go into lynching and the numbers of lynching in Georgia, highest number of lynchings between the 1880s and the mid 1960s, second highest number in the country, second only to Mississippi. So that history of violence, that reality of violence was always there, that threat of violence always there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments?
I want to prompt you because I knew it was there. I know you have a few photos of your family, so I just thought.
Oh, you want me to show that? Okay, all right. Okay, from Monroe to Atlanta. This is my mother in the pink dress on the left, and my grandmother. They were originally from Monroe, Georgia. They came, and I say they, my grandmother was a single parent. She was a domestic worker for much of her adult life. She lived and my mother grew up in an extended family. She was in the family with her grandmother, my great grandmother, and just a number of uncles and aunts. and they lived together and pooled their resources. And they all decided to, most all decided to come to Atlanta during the same time, and that was the late 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s. And I talked, I last talked to my mother, no, not recently, a few years ago. My mom now has dementia, but she was recalling that time. And keep in mind that the Great Migration not only was of African Americans from the South to the North, it was often African Americans from the rural South to the urban South. And that was the case with both my parents. My mother's family, and when they came to Atlanta, again, they all got jobs, they pooled their resources and lived in the same house for an extended period of time. It's interesting that just a few years after they left that area, left Monroe, there was what was called for a long time, the last mass lynching in America that occurred at Moore's Ford Bridge. And one of the women, May, and I'm blanking on last names, but it was two couples. And one of the women, May, was pregnant. They killed them and cut the baby out of her stomach. That woman, May, was a good friend to my great aunt Belle. So, that's how close this history is to me. And my aunt Belle never talked about it. And I only knew about it because my mother told me that my aunt's best friend was a victim of the Moore's Ford lynching. My mother went to school at Booker T. Washington High School. She worked I think downtown at a soda. She was a soda fountain. She talked about scooping ice cream and how it was so hard it would hurt her wrist. But she also, at that early age, got into what was really an early work study program, and she worked with preschoolers, and that ended up being her profession. She was one of Atlanta's first Head Start teachers, and she was a Head Start teacher, then a preschool Atlanta public school teacher until she retired in the 80s. And that's my father, who spent time, who came from, with his family, the Myrick family, from Warrenton County to Atlanta in the 1930s as well. And he spent a lot of time in Chicago, where I have a great uncle who was the pastor of a church and had a couple of businesses there. And so my father would spend time there. My father served in World War II. And as you know, that was when the Double V campaign was in play. Black people were fighting for victory abroad and victory at home. My father was in the Army. He was a private, and he joked that he never made it beyond being a private because he worked in the office. He was in communications. And he, wrote letters. He drove around in his cute little, in his Jeep. You see him draped over his Jeep. He was so proud of that. But his superior officer wanted him to essentially spy on his fellow Black brothers, the Black troops, and tell them what they were. And so each time he'd ask him, well, what do you have to report, or what's going on? He said, I have nothing to report, sir. And so consequently, although he received a good conduct medal, he received several medals because he was also a part of the invasion of Normandy. The Black troops came up the rear, and he talked about stepping over bodies as they were landing on the beaches of Normandy. But he never betrayed his fellow Black soldiers and became a spy. So he was very proud of that. And I'm very proud of him for that. My parents met in 1948 on the footbridge at Morris-Brown College. And they married in 1949. That's a picture of me at 3 or 4 years old at the construction site of our home, the home I grew up in, and the home my parents lived in for 60 years. And that community is a community called Urban Villa. And it was one of the first, after the war, post-war years, there was an extreme housing shortage for Black people. Couldn't find a place to live. The architect J.W. Robinson, and there were several construction, people in construction, and his name is escaping me, a big important man in construction. They began to build communities. Years before that, a man named Heman Perry built a number of homes on the west side. But after World War II, J.W. Robinson was among those. And J.W. Robinson was one of the first Black architects in the state to do big jobs, residential, and then business designs for throughout the city. And my father was a postal worker, postal clerk, and he did real estate on the side, and with 5 children. And for many years before, while we were still small, my mother did not work. She did not start working until we got a little older. And so I marveled that he was able to have this house built in the time. That's me again with my baby brother on the front steps of the house. It's a family portrait. And that's my parents enjoying a vacation in the early 1990s, I believe. And that's one of the last photos that they took together. So that's it. And I will stop sharing. Okay.
All right.
Do we still have folks with us?
We do. Do you have any last questions?
Any questions in the chat?
Nope, nothing on our end here.
All right.
Well, I hope that you got something out of it, that you and again, if you have questions later, I am very much open to receiving emails. Have no problem with that. So you can share my Morehouse email address with people if they have an interest. But I've enjoyed this. Again, I prefer a situation where it can be give and take, question and answer in real time.
Right.
But I hope I didn't put you to sleep.
Not at all.
Wonderful, wonderful information. It's given us a lot more to study and research. So it's just amazing information. In my hometown here, my mother, her senior year at Cartersville, well, the Summer Hill High School, it was, she was part of that first group that integrated, Summer Hill High School. So a lot of things that you were saying, and one of our educators here who had a son who was part of that group, his mother went to the AU Center. And so it's just amazing. And she talks about going to the AU Center and during that time and having a segregated daycare center, with bringing her child down there to Atlanta to school because the child could stay there with her while she was going to class or one of the dorms or something.
And so what's so amazing to me, and you're a good bit younger than I, but this is in our lifetimes. These are people, parents, grandparents who are still with us, who have these memories of, and I have memories of of segregation in the 60s, on into the late 60s, that I remember the first time I was called the N-word. It was shocking because I spent most of my young life, childhood, in a very insulated, protective environment. So I did not even encounter white people on a day-to-day basis, but going, to the zoo or going wherever after things opened up in terms of desegregation, that's when I first encountered racism on a very personal level. But we still hear we know that our parents, grandparents, and others, it's in memory. It's not long ago at all.
If I can join the conversation, I'm one of those mature people that you talk about, but I was part of what they call the Atlanta 9. So I was one of the first 9 people to desegregate the Atlanta public school system.
Grady High School, and forgive me for not mentioning Grady High. But
Brown High. I was out in the West End. I grew up on the Morehouse College campus.
Okay.
So Brown was the closest one for us, but we had to go through tests to get there. And the first year we had police escorts to get us from our homes to our schools. So
yes. And remind us of what year that was.
They started the process in 1960. 1961 was the first year that we were there for my junior and senior year, and I graduated in 1963 from Brown High.
And there was a similar initiative at Grady and then at Thurl. But was Brown High integrated for all your time there?
We were the first students that they had. It's now Brown Middle School, but it was Brown High School when I started. And
Yes.
there were 4 schools involved in the desegregation of Atlanta initially. North Side, Grady, Brown, and I forget, I'm having a senior moment now.
I
so
think it's
forget
Thurl.
Thurl
Mhm.
was the 4th school.
Mhm. Yes, well, thank you. I left that important history out, so I appreciate your sharing it.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Myrick-Harris, I just want to thank you for being here and sharing this important history and relevant history with us tonight. I think we've all learned something new, or given us inspiration to go out and learn more information about this important time and how it affects us even today. We appreciate you being here and doing that with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed it. And again, I would love to hear from individuals, and the woman who just spoke about her experience at Brown High. I'd love to hear from you, get your name, because I'd love to, I do oral history as well. So I'd love to do an oral history interview with you. So I'm Clarissa.Myrick-Harris at morehouse.edu.
I've got it.
Great. And your name?
Madeline Nix, Nix.
Nix. I know that name. Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, I grew up in Graves Hall.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Wonderful.
If anyone didn't get that email address, just reach out to one of us here on staff and we'll be happy to share that information with you and put y'all in contact together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And so thank you again for being here with us, and to all of you that participated, we thank you for being here and sharing this evening with us. Just as a reminder, we've got more things coming up in the future. One of the great ways you can keep in touch with us and share with us what we have going on throughout the years to become a member of the museum. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to consider becoming a member and joining us. We have lots of great opportunities for members, and you can find that information on our website. Again, we've got, you can see on the slide there, our next lecture on March 25th with Leslie Thomas to talk about Cherokee preservation, history preservation. And until then, we hope to see you soon in the museum, either virtually or in person. So everyone have a good evening, and we'll see you again soon.